Hello and welcome to Talking Events. My name's James Dickson and the podcast studio is today set up again in the fabulous surroundings of Twickenham Stadium. We were invited very kindly by the events and hospitality team here at Twickenham to come and set up the podcast studio and record a batch of episodes here for a couple of days. So we should start today's show by thanking them for their hospitality and for that information and for giving us the opportunity to invite our guests into some fabulous surroundings. And on that note, on to today's guests and on to today's subject. First of all, we're welcoming back to the Talking Events studio David Boswell from TSG. David, thanks for joining us again.
Thank you.
We're welcoming for the first time to Talking Events Alex Leake from Carlisle Support Services. Alex, thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you for inviting me.
And welcoming back into the studio Nick Halden from All Access Communications. Nick, thanks for joining us.
Pleasure to be here.
Moving things on from last week's discussion where David and Nick joined us last week to look at a very specific element of event security and the services that TSG provide. And David, shortly we'll give you an opportunity to just quickly recap what that is. We're going to talk today about event security in general, where we are with it at the moment, what's changing, what's differing, what we're paying a little bit more attention to, perhaps with a certain slant towards sporting events, because Alex, I know that you've got a area of expertise, certainly, and rich experience in the sporting arena. But let's start by quickly recapping. First of all, David, who are TSG? What is it that you guys do?
Yeah, sure. So I'm the Managing Director at TSG. TSG is an organisation newly launched last year. We provide trained and experienced personnel resources to respond and manage all that mainly sits outside the remit of conventional security. The impact factors of that can allow us to go in and substitute or supplement police resources or be a significant support aid for existing security arrangements on the ground.
Excellent. And Alex Leake from Carlisle Support Services, tell us a little bit about what your company does.
Yes, I'm the Sector Director for Events for Carlisle Support Services. We're based in Luton and have a rich heritage of supporting sporting venues with stewarding and security.
Excellent. And Nick Halden, back into this Talking Events studio again. Just give us an overview again of your background in the industry.
I used to report on events for sort of 13 odd years, sporting events with a big focus on security elements, as in the context of events in and around London and around the UK, and actually into Europe as well. I'm an observer rather than a supplier and I now run my own PR company called All Access Communications.
Super. So we all know who everybody is and what everybody does. Let's be quite broad in the start of today's episode and ask, perhaps with you, Alex, first of all, where we currently stand and where we are as an industry with our security arrangements for sporting events. We've got a major sporting event taking place this summer over in France. The European Championships are over there. There's been a lot made in the consumer press, certainly, about the security arrangements for that particular tournament. You deal with the security arrangements for a number of sporting events and different clients. Where are we with things at the moment, and how have things changed in the last 6 months and in the last 5 years?
I think if you take the last 6 months, obviously the problems in France have highlighted for the UK sporting network some serious problems. What I'm very pleased to say is that the response from those venues has been incredible in terms of taking ownership of the realities that might potentially encroach into the UK. And I'm very pleased to be associated with the Football Safety Officers Association, and I've seen firsthand their concerns and how they disseminate information from the anti-terrorist unit. And there's clear evidence when I've attended meetings for large sporting events that this is taken very, very seriously. And I think you've got to consider then everything that's done in the industry now has a cost implication. And it's useful to know that those establishments are taking that head on and supporting the needs that are identified not only by the police but as a consultative approach into those venues, identifying how they need to operate. And of course the key thing for everybody is the visitor experience. That's got to be maintained at all times.
A lot was made after the tragic events in Belgium and in Brussels about the communication between their intelligence services and the police services within that country. What we should perhaps highlight is the fact that at events and at sporting events, a lot of the time the security and the stewarding and the access, the ingress, the egress and the safety within those events is being dealt with by private companies. What current sort of experience have you got of working with the police services, with the intelligence services, and how is that line of communication in our own country?
I think it's excellent, actually. My first-hand experience has been attending the blue light meetings where the constabulary are involved from the very, very start of build-up to any event and supporting that venue with invaluable information. The venue owners and the management will always seek that support from the constabulary, and they take guidance from them. And in those meetings, we will then support that guidance process in achieving the ambitions and the goals for each individual event.
And Nick, as somebody who's observing events, have you noticed a shift in how security companies and events and venues are managing their security as a whole? I think we would all be in agreement in saying that we never want to sort of scaremongering is not something that anybody wants to do. But by the same token, I know over in Paris they've staged mock attacks and things like that to help response teams actually prepare for those sort of incidents. Is it something that you've seen UK event organisers or events of any description undertake, or what's our level of preparation like?
I think the preparation is really good, and the liaison between security organisers and the local police is always very good, and the information share through the Gothic initiative, which is a voluntary initiative run by the police, relatively recently introduced, I think is a fantastic step on. And so I think that while you don't necessarily get the mock-ups of things happening at live events, the preparation is very, very good.
Could you just expand a little bit for people listening who may not be familiar with what Gothic is?
Well, Gothic is an information share, so there's a slightly sanitised version of what the police information or intelligence is given out to event organisers. So, and if there is an incident around Festival X or event Y, that there's some information that there might be a particular threat, they will be, they will know what's going on. They will know by and large what the police know, and there's been a big buy-in by the event community to that, and it's a credit to the police that they've bothered to do that. I think because they're doing it of their own time and their own volition. And I think that's great.
David, I know that your company TSG are relatively newly launched as an entity, but are you aware of Gothic, and what interaction have you had with that so far?
Absolutely, yeah, and fully support the idea. The information sharing, I think, is going to be absolutely critical between all agencies as the years progress. Any improvement to that is always going to be encouraged. Operation Gothic, I think, is great as a central hub to disperse that information, sanitised, albeit to organisations like security, like venue owners, event organisers, so that we can then best prepare our resources working together to balance the threat and risk assessments.
How is that information being passed back from yourselves, Alex, as a service provider, to your actual clients, be that the venue, be that the event organiser?
Well, it's interesting you mentioned about mock-ups. One of the processes we go through with our customer base is they want to see what various aspects of the search process looks like. So we've had on a number of occasions had to mock up how it will look like for the public arriving at a particular venue, and our clients want to see that first because they want that warm, cuddly feeling that their customer base, their experience isn't going to be altered in any way, or they feel threatened by that process. And thank goodness that the UK community now that visit has now known that when they arrive there is this process to go through, and it is for their own safety and benefit.
When we look at the stages of security at a sporting event, I don't know what the precise terminology is, so correct me, but when we you have preemptive, the ingress into a venue, and then perhaps the responsive element that if something does go wrong, how are we going to deal with that?
Right.
What are we changing in terms of the preemptive checks, the preemptive security when we're getting people into venues now?
First of all is the element that is unseen, and those are spotters and strategic people in locations at entrances looking for specific profiles of people. What they're watching for is in effect them trying to make an entrance and then wonder why they're moving away. And the first thing that they will encounter is obviously a strong presence in that process, so it's deterring. So that's the first thing you see. There are then different levels of stewarding staff. There is a whole raft of people that are trying to churn and move people around. You will see now more barriers outside the sporting venues to try and channel people in through the processes. And of course you will see patting down and bag checks, which is something relatively new.
And is that being done on a 100% level? From an observation point of view, Nick, have you seen increased levels of things like bag checks of searches? Are there examples now where this is being done on 100% of people coming into a venue without any question?
It's certainly much more common in venues now, and that's obviously as a result of what happened in Paris. Interestingly, though, right on the back of the Paris terrorist attack, the first major event in this country was England playing France at Wembley, and that was a demonstrable kind of this is what we can do and don't mess with us message, and it's that I think is filtered down, and obviously it cost a lot of money, and it had the army and helicopters in the air, police everywhere, but that was an example, and I think that's being translated and has been taken on by organisers in the way that they now deliver their own sort of event security solutions.
Can we sustain that though? Because
no.
Surely there was a huge cost involved in that, wasn't there?
But that was an example. I think that's what I mean. That was this is the absolutely sort of best case scenario,
Yeah.
and everything else you see from that is it's an indication that everyone has ramped things up, and whether that's subliminal or not. But that's the inference that everybody, this is what we're showing you we can do, and everybody is reacting to this kind of level more discreetly. And I think that was the message that was coming out there.
Whilst we might not be able to sustain it quite at the level in that particular example, but it's important that we should highlight that as the example and
but it was demonstrable, and that was the thing. Yeah.
Is there now, though, Alex, a drive to increase security in terms of physical numbers of security, and how difficult is it to do that in major sporting venues? When we're talking at some of the biggest stadia that are available in this country, we're talking to thousands of bodies that are required to stage any quote-unquote normal sporting event, aren't we?
There is certainly a marked increase in numbers, but I think one thing's got to be taken into consideration, and that's the event itself. For example, a Saturday event will be more family orientated in principle, and the lead in time to capacity is wider, so therefore you've got more opportunity to channel those people in. Again, the visitor experience on arrival is much more smoother. But for example, a midweek football fixture, which is early evening, you've got a much smaller time, so your operational delivery model has to be slightly different to manage a sudden influx of people. And you mentioned the bag checks. Again, at this stage, for most of our venues, it is specific to certain profiles of people. We do believe ongoing that will start to increase to a more general checking. But the interesting thing is that the venues now do state on websites and information that they actually won't allow bags onto the site.
And where does the spectrum start and end when it comes to the time and the influx of people? Because as you pointed out, a Saturday event will have a different demographic to a midweek event. The midweek event will also naturally have a shorter period of time within which people are actually gaining access into that venue. Does that change at all a security provider's operations? Do you change the way that you do things? Do you have to put more people in there? How does it work when you know you're going to be dealing with a small window of opportunity or quite a large one? What are your experiences of that? I don't know if David's got experience of that. Or
The simple answer would be yes. Your your deployment schedules, would have to mirror, influxes of people and where the threat and risk is at its highest, and you move with those windows. So if you're going to have a short burst, a high density, come into a venue, then you have to have the resources to be able to manage those effectively but safely, as well as providing everything from public reassurance and the ability to react to any spontaneous occurrences, as opposed to an influx over a weekend where that ingress would be over a wider, a lengthier part of time.
How does it change, using that as an example, the actual time within which people are gaining access to the venue, but also the types of crowd? We could have a football crowd, we could have a tennis crowd, we could have a horse racing crowd. How do the types of crowd differ?
I think obviously you're talking about demographic, and I think that's certainly an area to highlight in regards to our resources as TSG. The different types of events, say, the demographic, if they're quite young, if they're quite excitable. For example, if you had a crowd management provider like Carlisle, they're responsible for the ingress, checking those bags, etc. What provisions are in place to ensure that the crowds on approach are behaving? I know Alex said about spotters, etc. And I would encourage that aspect. But in terms of being able to, if there is a possible problem seen or a threat, then how is that responded to? How is that reacted to? How is that removed from the equation? And that's where a resource like us, not saying as a tennis match, because again all different types of events will have their own threat and risk assessment, but say if it was a football sporting type event where you could get rival crowds, for example, we would be a resource that would be perfectly matched for something like that to deter and respond to pockets of, say, antisocial behaviour or certain risks or threats, to support the security arrangements in place dealing with that ingress.
Nick, it looked like you had something to add there.
Well, just that I know that another thing that Gothic does is it might highlight and it might say to security, actually get out there and check some people in the queue, and it will deliver that information beforehand, so they will get enough people to do that, and that will change the brief. So rather than just being within the walls, they might say, actually, can you go and have a chat or have a pat down in the queue? And they've got and the security teams then need to be able to respond to do that. And like David says, whether that brings in another element or a want for another element is an interesting part of the discussion, I think.
To just put you on the spot, Alex, we introduced our guests to each other prior to the recording of the episodes, and we always get everybody in a room prior to hitting the record button so that we can familiarise ourselves and introduce it and identify what each other does. Alex, when we introduced you to David today and briefly explained what TSG do in terms of essentially replacing special police services, SBS services at events, as a provider of stewarding and security, what was your initial reaction to being introduced to a private supplier that can replace that police service?
I was actually really interested in understanding, because our experiences to date would actually value the services purely and simply because our clients rely very heavily on a police presence, and more the feedback we're getting is that those local officers through the constabularies are actually looking to withdraw those services. That puts us at I wouldn't say at a risk, but it means that our relationship with our clients is that we've either got to look to additional support or in actual fact enhance the numbers to cover those elements. And we've had we'll have another conversation in around certain clubs that I think will be invaluable to you to support that process.
And Nick, again, I keep inviting you in as somebody with an outside opinion on things, but I think having that perspective is very, very valuable. How do you observe the potential relationship between the different types of security provider that are out there and how they could work together in the future with this? And it's perhaps unfair to generalise, but we should say that there is a differing of opinion between different police forces as to what their involvement should be within any given event, whether that be sporting or otherwise, isn't there? So is there now this opportunity for organisations and security organisations to work better and more closely?
Everyone knows the confines of their own specialism, so it's like a bit of a baton situation where you typically would pass from security to police. There's now, it needs to go somewhere because they're not the nature of what the job they do. hasn't changed, so that they're still within their own confines. And there needs to be someone on the other end to receive the baton to say, well, we'll look after that. And I think there is absolutely a gap for a company like TSG to come in and take it on, because I mean, police have got the best hearts, the ones I've spoken to, all they know what's right, they want to do everything they can, but there's diminished numbers, and this, let's not forget, this started changing as far back as 1999 when the law changed effectively, and so pre-austerity, but austerity has come and kicked them very hard into what they can and can't do. So there is now this there's a river between where the traditional security remit ends and where the police would come in because they have to, and you've got to put a bridge across that.
Within the venues that you work with, in Alex, with Carlisle, have you seen those diminished numbers? Have you been conscious of a very much a diminished level?
We personally haven't, and that's because a lot of our client base is in London, and those areas of London have got, I suppose, budgeted support within the police fundings. I think it's probably more prevalent outside of London, where perhaps some of the forces are strained and under pressure. But certainly in London we haven't seen any, and I guess probably because the London area is probably seen as a heightened target, potentially.
I think inevitably we would have to say that there is a higher level of sensitivity within the Greater London area. That's simply a case of its location. But have any of our panel seen examples of diminished outside of the Greater London area? Have you had experiences of looking in other or dealing with other events from around the UK that have had to cope with this?
I don't think there's been a huge amount. I mean, there's certainly events that I'm aware of that have been quite successful in terms of their police reductions and their approach to that and working with the authorities. But you can only increase security numbers so much because of essentially you're not gaining any additional skills or ability to react to situations because of security as fundamental as it is. Like I say, the police are there for a reason because they can bring to the table certain things that security officers can't. And that's really where, like I say again, where TSG come into the equation to accept that baton in replacement of the police that need to move away because of the austerity cuts and they just don't have resources in place. So like I say, increasing numbers is all well and good, but I think the entire industry needs to be cautious not to become complacent or be or have that as an illusion, as a smokescreen to say, well, it's okay, we don't need the police because we got all this amount of security, but in the event of something happening, what capacity and capability do those additional numbers have? Probably no more than what was there before, and that's instead of going through that method, bring in TSG to support the security staff and work very closely with the crowd management company so that they have that aid in the event anything happens or the daily occurrences that happen as they do in the modern age.
We certainly don't want to become complacent, do we? But is what appears to be this shift in how we are dealing with things and how we are managing things actually going to help the police to create a better focus for what they do very, very well and what they need to be doing, rather than in their eyes some of these elements of working at events, jobs that they could ideally do without because it's not the best use of their resources?
I think strategically they'll be able to realign their resources. So if they know that if they've got 100 cops etc. at an event, then those are resource that they're taken up. Whereas if you had another organisation in the mix, such as TSG working alongside crowd management companies, then the police in that local area have those resources at their dispersal to target different areas and put back into the public.
Alex, could I just ask you, I know you mentioned that you do a lot of work within the Greater London area and with a number of different venues, but inevitably I'm sure you've got experience of working outside of that
yes,
area as well. How I've read that there are quite different lines of communication and strategy from police force to police force. How difficult is it moving location and dealing with other forces, and how different is it working from force to force and working in liaison with those? Is there a great gulf in?
No, there isn't. what I'm pleased to say is that the venues that outside of London that we work with openly have open relationships with their local constabularies and have specific liaison officers that attend all of the build-up meetings. We attend those as well, so that we're at the heart of the discussions in and around the needs for that specific event. And I've attended a number of these meetings, and I'm pleased to see that the venue management is taking on board very specific requirements that have been highlighted by the constabulary in respect of that up-and-coming event. And again, very pleased that we've been invited along to support that process to make sure that the event runs smoothly.
Nick, within the UK events industry, where do we sit with our current level of security and the skill with which we deliver it in comparison to European events, to global events? Are we leading the way? Are we playing catch up with other countries? Do we think that we set a lot of examples for people?
Thank you. I think the UK model is very, very good. I think because it's adaptive and it grows with circumstance and it adapts very, very quickly. And that's because, again, you've got the requisite skills in the requisite areas, and there are again the management cores of a number of companies drawing from the same pool. So people, SIA licensed security operatives, know what they're doing within the confines of that license. And there's a lot of very, very good people running private security companies who will be liaising with the police, liaising with local authorities, liaising with organisers to know what they need to do and what they need to address. So I would argue that there isn't many places better or better equipped to deal with things than this country.
How are we communicating with our peers and your peers, Alex, outside of the UK? Is it something that you're involved in?
Not directly at the moment, but it's something that we're looking at. Just touching back to the sort of the European, it's interesting that most of the European venues look to the UK for guidance and consultation, and I suppose there are a number of stadium management people that have now gone to Europe and further afield because they've been poached because of their knowledge and understanding. We are recognised as one of the best functions in Europe.
I'm keen to ask, as we progress with this episode, what are the concerns coming out of venues and from event organisers when it comes to security? Recent concerns, are there questions that you're being regularly asked, David and Alex, as service providers? What's cropping up at the moment?
Well, it has been touched on earlier, the resource. Within London and the provinces, there is only a certain amount of SIA officers, and that's within sort of a limited pool in locations. So that is certainly a concern, but we're sort of taking initiatives in our training so that we're taking people on and putting them through SIA training so that we're building our own pool. What we are very lucky with at Carlisle Support Services is our parent company is a company called Impellum, and one of the divisions is Blue Arrow. So we've got a really, really good facility to tap into our sister company in identifying people in areas, so we can actually get 200 or 300 people to a location, whether they be security officers or cleaning staff, through our sister company, which is invaluable and perhaps quite unique for us.
Do we need more full-time people, full-time staff who are choosing this sort of pathway and working in security for events as a career, as opposed to the transient nature of a lot of the staff that make up the portfolios of staff within the various different securities companies? We touched on the fact that some of the stewards and the event stewarding companies, the event security companies, essentially are drawing from the same pool of people. Do we need to go on a drive to get more people involved in this and do it as a career?
Well, what's interesting about that is because the venues now need earlier support and later support by nature of events. I mean, our clients want to open up their premises for as long as possible because it's cash generation.
Secondary stream revenue.
Absolutely. But the beauty about that is then that it widens the day, as it were, and therefore we're able to offer our officers a longer day. And so people are naturally moving into the full-time, and with a lot of our clients, if they don't see that regular face, they think there's something wrong. Oh, is Bob ill or whatever? And it is naturally turning round, so that we're now being able to offer a larger amount of our staff full-time opportunities. And of course, that generates all sorts of additional benefits to our business.
Excellent. And from a general training point of view, are we at a suitable level? Could there be more done for the various different levels of event security that there are? Stewarding, SIA, the almost next tier of service that David and TSG are going to bring to the industry. Do we need to revise as a whole those tiers of training and how we're developing the staff that are delivering those particular services?
I think the SIA, in terms of the door supervisors course, I know there's the spectator safety. I think they're, both of those are, very good, and they've done a lot for the industry as a whole. The only thing, in terms of what I would say across the conventional board is the consistency, and that being that the training that you need, which is industry requirement, isn't as often as perhaps you would wish. But then, of course, making those more regular, there are cost implications, and how do those costs get passed on, from the individual, is it the security company, would that then go on to the end user? There's lots of different impact factors. I'd say what is in place is good, and perhaps maybe the larger organisations like Carlisle, I'm sure, have their own in-house, briefings, before each event to keep it fresh in mind before an event actually goes
going
live.
back to that sort of transient nature of a lot of the staff that work with these organisations, does that make the delivery of CPD and continued professional development quite tricky for an organisation like yours, Alex?
In principle, yes, but the fact that the hours are changing, the industry is changing, the fact that we've naturally starting to get longer shift patterns for these people. Having said that, on arrival at any event, whether they've worked for us for the first time or for 3 years, they will undergo that same initial training at the start beforehand, and they will receive that every single time. That's a standard practice, because it goes through specifics for the particular event that have been identified and cascaded down, and it's that information that's paramount. And of course, the other thing around the service is auditing and having external auditors to check the individuals. And you're right that there is some disparity around qualifications and the training, and it's about retraining. It's a fact of life in our industry. That's what you've got to do, but you've got to do it at low and no cost, so there's no impact to the client.
I'm just going to throw something in here that we found whilst recording this episode, and this is actually from today. This was published 8 hours ago by the Associated Press, and it's an announcement, quite simply, that public safety officials will hold a news conference to discuss the planning for this year's Boston Marathon. So they're actually going to publicly state, if I'm reading this press release correctly, what measures are going to be in place, the agencies that are involved in delivering those measures, how it's going to be done. And initially, this strikes me as something that's being done to publicly say openly, here's what we're doing, A, to reassure people, but also as a deterrent to anybody who may be considering any sort of undue act. Is that something that we could learn from, and is there an opportunity for us to be more public and more communicative in terms of how events and venues are saying that they are delivering their security?
I think so. I think the problem possibly with the event management industry in this country is that we are perhaps slightly insular, and there needs to probably be a platform where there can be a broader communication. That's certainly something that's very public, and I think probably that will be noted by a number of key venues in the UK to see how they could fit and perhaps roll that same sort of strategy out.
Nick, what are your thoughts on events in general being more open, not so much open, but actually publicly stating how they're going to deal with things as a means of reassurance and a means of deterrent?
Yeah, I think you need to play to generics a bit and say that we're doing this, and we've got these different levels of security. And I think it's a bit like speed cameras approaching, isn't it? When you get the signs, statistically, how many people slow down in light of those signs with no sign of a speed camera, and just the indication that there's going to be one. And I think there's a lot to be said for that. Yeah.
We are just about out of time for today's episode. A fascinating subject, one that is going to be very, very relevant in the short, medium and long term. This is an ongoing issue within the industry and something that is going to continue to develop and evolve, no doubt. If you've got an opinion, if you've got a comment, something that you would like to share relating to this particular topic, do feel free to tweet at Talking Events with any comments on today's episode. We'll tweet some links out to the organisations that have been on today's episode, so that if any of our listeners have got questions to put directly to any of our panellists today and our guests, they can do so. We should round up, first of all, by thanking our hosts again for today, Twickenham Stadium, the event and the hospitality team, but more importantly to our three guests on today's episode. David Boswell from TSG, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you.
Alex Leake from Carlisle Support Services, thank you for joining the
Thank
podcast. Nick Halden, once again, from All Access Communications, thank you for coming on Talking Events.
Pleasure.
You can subscribe to the podcast via iTunes. You can watch it via the Event Industry News YouTube channel and via eventindustrynews.co.uk. My name is James Dickson, and you've been listening to Talking Events.